Welcome to this explainer. For centuries, the name Boudicca has basically meant one thing to most of us: a fiery, unyielding, deeply emotional vengeance against the Roman Empire. But today, we are completely challenging that traditional narrative. Because, when we actually strip away the myth, we uncover a leader who is far more complex, calculating, and quite frankly, brilliant than the old stories tell us. So, we've all heard the legend, right? A usurped queen, publicly flogged, her daughters assaulted, who just suddenly erupts in a blind rage. It's a totally visceral story, and it's captivated people for 2 millennia. But honestly, framing her uprising purely as this sudden, blind rage drastically diminishes the sheer scale and the strategic brilliance of what she actually pulled off. While those horrific abuses absolutely happened, no doubt about it, the historical evidence points to a much more methodical, highly calculated insurgency. The Roman historian Tacitus is really the guy who established this traditional narrative. He framed her uprising, which happened around AD 60 or 61, strictly as an emotional reaction to Roman brutality after the death of her husband, Prasutaticus. According to his accounts, the Romans ignored Prasutaticus's will, seized his lands, and humiliated his family. Tacitus even went so far as to invent this incredibly stirring, dramatic speech for her, positioning her purely as a victim of Roman licentiousness and a champion of liberty. But we really have to remember that Tacitus was writing through a highly specific Roman lens, one that consistently reduced the complex political motivations of its enemies down to simple, primitive emotions. Now, what's really fascinating here is the stark contrast between the patriarchal Roman worldview and the progressive norms of Celtic society. To the Romans writing this history, the very idea of a female military commander was a terrifying anomaly. It was something that had to be explained away or categorized in a way that fit their own biases. But in the Celtic world, gender roles were not strictly binary when it came to leadership and power. Celtic women were absolutely not confined to the home. They were recognized for their massive contributions to society, completely regardless of their sex. In fact, Celtic women possessed incredible societal freedoms. They could divorce their husbands, they retained independent judicial rights, and they actually ruled as monarchs. Women like Boudicca, Cardamandua of the Brigantes, and Anna Mars possessed immense agency. They served as military leaders, they held judicial power, and that completely defies the Roman stereotype. So when Roman historians described Boudicca as terrifying and unnaturally masculine, they were really just projecting their own patriarchal anxieties onto a society that actively empowered women to lead armies and shape politics. And that brings up a genuinely fascinating mystery. Why on earth would Prasutaticus leave his own wife out of the succession in a society that so readily embraced female rulers? He literally split his kingdom between his daughters and Emperor Nero, explicitly leaving Boudicca out. While academic analysis suggests he might have intentionally excluded her because she was already exhibiting dangerous anti-Roman sentiments, Prasutaticus might have been desperately trying to protect his kingdom by placating Rome, recognizing that Boudicca was likely already building underground networks of resistance that threatened his delicate, fragile alliance with the empire. And the timing of this rebellion, it definitely wasn't a coincidence. It was an absolute perfect storm. The Iceni had already clashed with Rome years earlier in AD 47. By the time Prasutaticus died in AD 60, the Roman governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus had taken his main forces far off to the northwest to attack a Druid stronghold on the island of Mona. It is incredibly unlikely that this alignment of events was purely by chance. The sudden absence of the Roman legions gave Boudicca the exact tactical window she needed to strike with maximum impact. So again, we have to ask, was this just a spontaneous eruption of grief? Think about the colossal logistics involved here. How do you rally up to 230,000 warriors from disparate, fiercely rival tribes overnight? In an era before instant communication, it is logistically impossible to unite a massive army like that in a matter of days. Even if we assume ancient historians exaggerated the final numbers a bit, the core truth remains that Boudicca commanded a phenomenal, multi-tribal force. This strongly suggests she had been secretly fomenting a strategic rebellion and utilizing her diplomatic skills to build alliances way before her husband ever died. The terrible abuses Boudicca suffered were really just the spark for a powder keg that had been methodically packed for years. The Iceni and their neighbors were literally being bled dry by Roman exploitation. The Romans were recalling old political gifts as loans, including a staggering 40 million sesterces loaned from the supposedly Stoic philosopher Seneca the Younger. Yeah, he was aggressively acting as a ruthless debt collector. On top of that, the locals were being heavily taxed to fund a massive temple to the former Emperor Claudius. The financial and cultural tyranny was totally systematic. And Boudicca's response? It was equally calculated. She didn't just go on some chaotic rampage, she executed a methodical and incredibly bloody military campaign. She went straight for the logistical and cultural hearts of Roman Britain. First, she completely obliterated the veteran colony of Camalodunum, crushing the retired soldiers living there. Then she moved right on to the thriving commercial hub of Londinium and finally Verulomium. She even intercepted and routed the Roman Ninth Legion when they tried to stop her early on. This wasn't blind rage, guys. This was a masterclass in targeted, strategic warfare aimed at totally crippling Roman infrastructure. Now, the human cost of this campaign was absolutely staggering. Up to 80,000 civilians were killed across those 3 settlements. The archaeological evidence literally proves the apocalyptic scale of this destruction. To this very day, if you dig deep enough under modern London, there's a thick, distinct red layer of burnt, oxidized debris dating precisely to AD 60. The Roman historian Cassius Dio describes gruesome, uncompromising violence. Boudicca's forces weren't interested in taking prisoners. This was a war of absolute annihilation intended to drive the Romans off the island forever. Realizing he couldn't save everyone from this massive onslaught, the Roman governor made a brutally cold, calculated decision to sacrifice London. For his final stand at Watling Street, he chose his geography meticulously. Knowing he was vastly outnumbered, he outright refused to meet Boudicca on open ground. Instead, he positioned his men with a dense, impenetrable forest behind them, funneling the approaching Britons into a narrow passage. By using the landscape itself as a weapon, he entirely neutralized Boudicca's ability to flank his much smaller army. Despite being vastly outnumbered by as much as 20-1, the heavily armored Romans used that narrow choke point to completely neutralize the Britons' massive numerical advantage. The Roman forces, numbering only around 10,000, stood shoulder to shoulder in a tight, disciplined formation. The Britons, on the other hand, though numbering in the hundreds of thousands, were a diverse coalition of warriors pushing forward into a tight gap where only a tiny fraction of them could actually engage in combat at any given time. And then came a fatal logistical error that turned a tactical retreat into an absolute slaughter. The Britons were so incredibly confident in their victory that they had actually brought their families in wagons to watch the battle. They arranged them in a dense semicircle right behind their own lines. So, when the Romans exhausted their javelins and pushed forward in a tight, disciplined wedge formation, the Britons tried to fall back, only to find themselves completely trapped against their own supply train. This devastating hubris led to a decisive defeat and ultimately Boudicca's death. So what does this all mean for us today? Well, reducing Boudicca just an emotional avenger totally strips her of her real agency and intellect. Reclaiming her as a master strategist does her historical reality true justice. When we look at the complex logistics of her alliances, the precise timing of her uprising, and the deeply systematic nature of her campaign, we don't just see a grieving widow lashing out. We see a highly intelligent political operator and military commander who got the greatest empire on earth to the very brink of losing Britain entirely. She really forces us to rethink how quickly we label historical women as merely emotional or reactive. As we wrap up this explainer, we are left with a pretty provocative thought. The texts we rely on were written by men who fundamentally believed women were emotionally volatile and totally unsuited for leadership. It leaves us wondering, if her enemies hadn't been the ones to write her story, how differently would we view this incredible military mastermind today? It definitely changes how you look at history, doesn't it?